She had not expected the silence to have a sound, but it did. It moved through the house like weather. The letter had said his name was Harwick. It had said he was a carpenter by trade, that he owned land north of Pemberton, that the house had 2 rooms and a stove that drew well in winter. It had said he was not a difficult man. She had read it 4 times on the train west, and then once more in the dark, holding it close to the window glass, where the last light from a passing town let her see the words, and then she folded it and put it away and did not take it out again. She was the last off at the Pemberton stop. A woman behind her had already gathered her 2 children and a basket and stepped down into the arms of a man who had been waiting on the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it around and around. She had watched that without meaning too, the way the man pressed his forehead briefly to the woman's temple, and she had looked away and picked up her bag. He was standing apart from the others. She knew him before he spoke because he was the only man there alone. He said her name. Just the one word, and it came out as a question, though it did not rise at the end the way questions usually did. She said yes. He took her bag from her without asking and walked toward a wagon that was already loaded with lumber on the back, still smelling of the mill. She followed. It was 40 minutes to the house. Neither of them spoke except when he said, near the middle of the drive, that the road would be better once the spring mud dried. She said that was good to know. He nodded and looked at the horses. The house sat back from the road in a clearing of spruce. It was small and square, and the porch boards were new, the wood still pale. She noticed the porch first. Then she noticed that the window frames had been recently painted, and that there was a rag rug inside the front door that had not come from a store. She stood in the main room while he brought her bag up the 2 steps and set it inside the door. He said, "The kitchen is through there. She could see it through the open doorway," he said. "The loft is yours." She looked at the ladder on the far wall. He said, "I sleep in the lean-to off the back." She nodded. He said he would start supper if she wanted to wash up first. She said that would be fine. He showed her where the water barrel was and where the basin hung on the wall, and then he went into the kitchen, and she heard him lift the iron lid of the stove and the sound of wood being added, one piece and then another. She washed her face and hands and looked at herself in the small mirror nailed above the basin. She did not look the way she felt. She looked ordinary. A woman of 28 with brown hair and a face that gave nothing away if she chose not to let it. She had chosen that a long time ago. He cooked salt pork and tinned beans and sliced bread from a loaf that was already 2 days old. It was a plain meal, and he did not apologize for it. She ate everything on her plate. After, he washed the dishes and she dried them, and he showed her where they went, pointing at each shelf as he handed things to her, and she remembered. She was good at remembering. It had always been the one skill she was certain of. That night she lay in the loft and listened to the house settle around her. She could hear the stove cooling, the tick and ping of the metal. She could hear the wind coming down off the mountain, moving through the spruce in a long, unhurried sweep. She could not hear him. She had brought one thing that was not practical, a tin box small enough to fit in both palms that had belonged to her mother. Inside it were 3 buttons from a coat she could not remember anymore, a folded photograph she could not bring herself to look at on the train, and a piece of ribbon, dark red, that she had tied and untied so many times it had worn soft as cloth. She did not open the box. She set it on the floor beside her and lay with her hand near it and went to sleep. He was up before her. She came down from the loft to find the fire already going and coffee sitting on the back of the stove and him gone. She found him by following the sound of a hammer out past the back of the lean-to, where he was working at a fence that ran along the tree line. He did not see her coming. She stood and watched him work. He drove nails with 2 strikes each, no wasted motion, his whole attention on the wood in front of him. She went back inside and poured herself coffee and sat at the table and looked out the window at the clearing and the trees and the pale sky above them, and she thought, so this is what it is. She was not sure if that thought was good or bad. She left it where it was. He came in around mid-morning and poured his own coffee and stood at the counter. She was mending a hem. She had brought her sewing things in a small roll of canvas and had spread them out on the table that morning without asking. And he had not said anything when he came in, just looked at the table and then looked away. He asked if she needed anything from the store in town. He was going in on Thursday. She said she would make a list. He said, "Mrs. Kale runs the dry goods. She knows what most women use." She nodded. She did not say that she had always made her own lists. She made the list anyway, and on Thursday he took it without looking at it and folded it into his shirt pocket and came back in the late afternoon with a box of things she had written down and 2 things she had not. A packet of dried apricots and a small bottle of vanilla, which he set on the counter without comment and which she did not mention either. The first real difficulty came at the end of the 2nd week. There had been a sound in the night, a branch down on the roof, and she had come halfway down the ladder before she caught herself, heart loud in her chest. He was already standing in the main room with a lamp. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Just a branch." She said she knew. She went back up to the loft and lay down and listened to her own heartbeat slow. She did not sleep for a long time after that. What she thought about, lying there, was not the branch. She had not been startled by the branch. She had been startled by the lamp, by the fact of it already lit, the light swinging up at her, a man standing in the dark with fire in his hand. It had reached something old in her, something she had been careful not to let get too close to the surface. She had come a long way to get here. That was not a small thing. She had left behind a farmstead outside Almonte that had been in her family since her grandparents crossed from County Antrim, and she had left it because her father was gone and her brother was gone. And there was a cousin who had wanted the land more than he had wanted to be decent about it. She had signed over her share of nothing and taken the train west, and she had answered the advertisement because she had been practical about it, in a way she was not always able to be practical. She had needed somewhere to be. She had not let herself think too carefully about what that somewhere might require of her. She thought about it now. The ceiling of the loft was low and smelled of cedar shingles. She could see the knots in the wood above her face in the dark, because she had been looking at them long enough that her eyes had adjusted. She thought about the lamp. She thought about the fact that he had not asked why she was frightened. He had just told her what it was and let her go back to sleep. She thought that was decent of him. It was not nothing. She found her work in the house by feel, the way you find a room in the dark. She started with the kitchen because the kitchen was familiar and because there were things there that needed doing. The shelf above the stove was thick with old grease, and she scrubbed it until the wood came back pale. She reorganized the canning jars by size. She found a crack in the floor near the door that let cold air up and packed it with rags until she could get proper chinking. He watched her do these things without comment, but she noticed, and she always noticed, that when he passed through the kitchen while she was working, he did not walk in front of her. He went around. He gave her the space she was using as though it had always been hers. She started cooking real meals. Nothing elaborate, but things that took time. Bread from scratch, a rabbit stew with dried thyme she had brought from Almonte in a small paper parcel, a pie made from the dried apricots using lard pastry her mother had taught her by holding her hands. He ate everything she set in front of him. He never said it was good, but he ate everything, and he was there at the table each time without being called twice. She learned his schedule. He was up at first light and out by the time she came down. He came in at midday for 20 minutes, enough time to eat something and drink water and go back. He came in for the evening before dark, washed up at the basin without being told, sat at the table. He did not talk much at meals, but he was not absent either. He looked at her when she spoke. He answered when she asked something. One evening she said, without planning to, that she had seen a great gray owl on the fence post near the tree line that afternoon. And he looked up from his plate and said that he had been hearing one for 2 weeks but hadn't seen it yet. They sat with that for a moment. Then he went back to eating. She thought about that small exchange for 2 days. The trouble with Renshaw started the 3rd week. Renshaw was the man whose property ran along the east side of the land. She had seen him twice at a distance, once on horseback and once on the road into town. A compact man with a red beard who moved like he was always slightly irritated at having to be somewhere. On the Tuesday of that 3rd week, he came to the house while the man was in the bush running survey lines, and he knocked and she answered. He took off his hat. He said he had come to pay his respects, that he had heard the man had taken a wife. She said, "Come in," and offered him coffee because that was what you did, and she had been raised to be decent regardless of how much she wanted not to. He sat at the table and looked around the kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had sat there before. She also noticed that he did not look at her the way most men would look at a woman they had just met and were being polite to. He looked at her the way men look at something they have already made a decision about. He said, "You're from back east then?" She said, "Yes." He said, "He put an advertisement in the paper?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Practical of him. He said it the way you say something to watch what happens next." She poured his coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table and looked at him. She had dealt with men like this before. There was a particular kind of man who used politeness as a blade and kept it sharp by using it gently. She was not afraid of this man. She was watchful. He said, "He tell you much about the land?" She said, "Enough." He said, "The East Quarter has a good stand of timber." Said it like he was just observing. Said, "He'll need a hand getting it out if he wants to get it to the mill before freeze up." Said he himself might be looking to expand his operation, might be worth the two of them talking. She said she would let him know her husband was interested in speaking with him. He looked at her. He had not expected that word, or the way she said it. She watched him recalibrate. He drank his coffee and said, "Yes, you do that." And he put his hat back on and left, and she sat at the table for a while after she heard his horse move off down the lane. When the man came in that evening, she told him Renshaw had been by. He went still for just a moment at the wash basin. He did not turn around. He said, "What did he want?" She told him what had been said. She told him exactly because she had the kind of memory that held things whole. She told him about the timber and the mill and the offer to expand. She did not tell him about the way Renshaw had looked at her, because she did not want to make more of it than it was. But she told him enough. He dried his hands and sat down and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I appreciate you telling me." She said, "That's what I'm here for." He looked at her then in a way he hadn't before. She couldn't have said what was in it exactly, but it was not nothing. What changed between them happened slowly, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a season changing. Not in any single moment, but accumulating, until one day the light was different and you understood that something had shifted without you marking the precise hour. He started leaving things. Not gifts, not quite. A square of tin sheeting set beside the door because she had mentioned the gap there. A new bar of soap wrapped in paper on the shelf by the basin. A folded piece of oilcloth put under the bread bin where the water had been coming up. He did not say anything when he left these things. He did not point to them or wait to be thanked. They were just there when she came to that part of the room. She started leaving things too, without deciding to. A plate kept warm on the back of the stove when he came in late from the far field. His good coat, brushed and hung back up after she found it fallen from the peg. A cup of water set out in the mornings on the end of the counter nearest the door so he could drink it as he went. Neither of them spoke about any of it. One evening in early November, when the first snow had come and the light died early and there was nothing to do outside, he stayed at the table after supper, and she stayed too because she had her mending. He read. She had seen him read before, but never at leisure, just a farm paper or a bill of sale. Now it was a book, worn at the spine, and she did not ask what it was. She sewed, and he read, and the stove worked at the cold, and outside the snow fell through the dark without any sound at all. At some point, she became aware that he had stopped reading. She looked up. He was looking at the window, he said. "Hard winter coming." She said, "I know." He said, "You've wintered in the north before?" She said, "My first one was at my grandparents' place on the Ottawa. 2 feet in a night. I was 7. He said, "Were you frightened?" She thought about it. She said, "I thought it was beautiful. I didn't know yet what it cost." He was quiet. Then he said, "That's about right." She went back to her mending. She took one more stitch and then stopped because her hands had gone still without her meaning them to, and she sat with her hands in her lap and the fire in the stove and the snow outside and this man at this table, and she thought, I didn't know what it cost. She had learned. She had learned what it cost to love a place and then lose it, to love a person and then stand at the edge of a grave in November mud and understand that the debt the living carry is that they have to keep going. She had paid those costs. She had come out the other side of them thinner, maybe, and quieter, and carrying that tin box with the ribbon inside it, and she had gotten on a train and she had come here. She had not expected here to feel like anything yet. The morning she understood was a Saturday. She had come down from the loft before him, which was unusual, because she had woken early with a dream she could not remember, except that it had left her feeling scraped clean. She made the fire and made the coffee, and sat at the table and watched the light change outside the window. The dark going first to gray, and then to something the color of pewter, and then the sun came over the ridge and caught the snow on the spruce branches and turned it briefly to fire. She heard him in the lean-to. She heard the particular sound of his boots on the floor there, the specific sequence of it which she had learned without meaning to. One boot, a pause, the other boot, the way he moved to the door. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her already there. He said, "You're up," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He went to the stove and poured his coffee. He stood there with it and she thought he might go back out, but he didn't. He pulled out the chair and sat down across from her, the way he had been sitting across from her for almost 2 months now, and he looked at his coffee. He said, "I want to say something." She waited. He said, "I know you didn't come out here for the pleasure of it. I know what the advertisement said, and I know it wasn't much to come to." He looked at her. He said, "You've made it more than it was. I want you to know I see that." She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at the window. Then she said, "You've made it easy to work in." He looked at her then. She held it, that look, longer than she had let herself hold any of the others. It was a plain face in a plain light in a plain kitchen. And there was nothing remarkable about any of it except that she felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, that she was being seen accurately, not as a solution to a problem, not as a woman who had answered an advertisement, not as a set of skills that could be useful in winter, as herself, as the person who had watched the snow fall in the dark and said, "I didn't know yet what it cost," and meant it. He had heard that. She understood now that he had heard it. She said, "I've been thinking about the East Quarter." He said, "The timber." She said, "Renshaw wants it." He said, "I know." She said, "You should log it yourself this winter. Take on 2 men for the season. Get it to the mill before the river breaks. What you get for that timber would let you buy the Callum parcel in the spring." He was quiet. Then he said, "I hadn't thought that far ahead." She said, "I have." He looked at her again, and this time there was something in it she recognized as surprise, and underneath the surprise, something else. Something that took her a moment to name. She named it as respect. He said, "You want to come with me to look at it?" "The timber stand," he said. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds." She said yes. They went out on a Sunday in weather that was cold but clear. The snow hard packed and the sky above the ridge a blue she had not seen since she was a child and thought the color of things was something you could keep. He broke trail and she followed in his tracks because the snow was thigh-deep in places. And he was taller, and it was practical. She was not a woman who mistook practicality for something lesser. The timber stand was older than she had expected. Spruce and fir and some white pine, thick through the middle, standing in the cold without any sound. He stopped at the edge of it, and she came up beside him, and they stood and looked in at it together. She could see, by the angle of the light and the layout of the land and the way the drainage ran, exactly how the logging should go. Which trees to take first, which to leave, where to put the skid road, how far to the creek where the drive could begin in spring. She saw all of it in the time it took her to take a slow breath. She did not say all of it. She had learned in the weeks here that he was not a man who wanted things laid out for him. He wanted to come to them himself and have someone there who could tell if he had come to them right. So she said one thing. She said, "That rise to the north, that's where I'd start." And he looked at where she meant and was quiet for a moment and then nodded. He said, "My father started from the north too." She said, "Did he log this land?" He said, "Cleared some of it. He died before the timber was worth much." She did not say she was sorry. She had noticed early on that he did not want that kind of sympathy. She said, "Then he did the harder work." He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the trees. He said quietly, "Yes, that's right." They stood in the timber for a while longer. Her feet were cold, but she did not say so. At some point, his arm was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of it through her coat, and she thought that was sufficient. She thought that was, in fact, a great deal. She did not love him by December, not in any way she could have put a word to, but she was learning him. She was learning the sound of his breathing when he was working at something he was unsure of. She was learning the specific quality of his silences. There were at least 4 different kinds, and she had named them all privately. She was learning that he was careful with wood, the way some men are careful with animals, not because he was sentimental, but because he understood the nature of what he was working with. And she was beginning to think, she was letting herself begin to think, that he was learning her too. On a night in December, she could not sleep, and she came down from the loft and found the kitchen cold and the stove out, and she rebuilt the fire and sat there waiting for the warmth to come up. He came to the kitchen doorway. He did not say anything about the hour. He pulled out his chair and sat down. She poured water into the pot and set it on the stove. They waited together for it to heat. She opened the tin box. She had not opened it since the night she arrived. She took out the ribbon, dark red, soft as cloth from all the years, and set it on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not ask, she said. It was my mother's. He said, she's gone? She said, yes, and my father and my brother the winter before I came here. He was quiet for a long time. The water was starting to make its first sound in the pot. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce and the house held against it. He said, I lost my wife 4 years ago. The baby with her. She had not known that. He had not said it in the letter. She looked at him across the table and saw the cost of it, still there, not raw anymore, but carried the way you carry something heavy for long enough that you stop noticing the weight until someone points to your hands. She said. He said. I wasn't going to say it. I don't know why I said it. She said. You said it because I showed you the ribbon. He looked at it on the table. He looked at her. He said yes. She picked up the ribbon and held it in her hand, and then set it back down on the table in the same place between them, and she left it there. That winter, she thought sometimes about the word her grandmother had used for the feeling of coming home after a long time away. The word in Irish that meant the ache in returning. The particular quality of grief that was also relief, that was also love, that could only exist in a person who had left and come back and understood both the leaving and the returning for what they were. She was not home. This was not her grandmother's farmstead, not County Antrim, not Almonte. It was a square house on a clearing north of Pemberton with a low ceiling in the loft and a stove that drew well in winter, and a man who drove nails with 2 strikes each and left a bar of soap on the shelf without saying anything. But she thought. And this was what surprised her, what she turned over in the cold dark of the loft and held up to look at. She thought that home might not be a place you recognized. It might be a place you grew. By January, she knew where everything went in that kitchen, as well as she had known her own body. By February, she could tell by the sound of his step on the porch what kind of day he had had. By March, when the light began to come back, and the snow on the south-facing slope began to soften, and the one crow that had wintered with them showed up every morning. On the fence post, looking personally affronted by the cold, she had started to believe, carefully, that she might be allowed to stay, not because she had to. That was the part she had not expected. Not because there was nowhere else. Not because the letter had been signed and the train had run in one direction, and this was what remained. But because she had woken one morning in March and listened to the sounds of the house coming alive around her, the stove, the step on the floor below, the crow, and she had lain there and thought, I want this. She had not wanted a thing that was specific and present since before her brother died. She had forgotten what it felt like to reach toward something that was actually there. She came down from the loft that morning, and he was already at the table. He had made the coffee. He had left her cup on the counter nearest the stove, so it would warm, the way she had started leaving his water near the door. She looked at the cup for a moment. She picked it up and sat down. He was looking at the window. She looked at the window too. The light on the snow in the clearing was doing something complicated, going from gold to white depending on the cloud, and the trees at the edge were beginning, just the faintest alteration, to look the way trees look when they have decided to start again. She said, the Callum parcel, I think you should make the offer this week. He said, I was thinking the same. She said, if you get it, the east boundary will run all the way to the creek. He said, we'd need to put up more fence. She said, yes. He said, That's 2 summers of work, easy. She looked at him. She said, I'm not going anywhere. He held that for a moment. Outside, the crow arrived on the fence post. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. He said, I know, that was all. 2 words, unremarkable in themselves, carrying the weight of a winter, and 2 people sitting across from each other with the specific, ordinary gravity of people who have decided to stay. She drank her coffee. He looked out the window. The light changed on the snow, and the crow ruffled its feathers against the cold, and somewhere to the north the timber stood waiting, and the land ran to the creek, and the morning continued on around them the way mornings do. Without ceremony, without announcement, simply and entirely itself.